He was a man who believed nothing in the world could touch him, a billionaire CEO who owned skyscrapers, oil fields, and even politicians. To his followers, he was a genius. To his rivals, he was untouchable. That night, he sat in the city's most luxurious restaurant, golden chandeliers blazing above him as he arrogantly ordered his favorite rare steak. But when the black waitress leaned forward and quietly slipped a folded note onto his table, his smirk vanished. He opened it with careless arrogance and instantly froze. His hand shook, his wine glass nearly toppled, and the color drained from his face. 7 words, just 7 words, cut deeper than any knife. They dragged him back to the one place he thought he had buried forever, Miami. And in that moment, in front of his laughing guests and glittering empire, Richard Halden realized his darkest secret was no longer buried. It had just come back to destroy him. Richard Halden was a man who thought the world bent to his will. As the billionaire CEO of Halden Industries, he had built a fortune from oil, shipping, and technology, climbing to a place where governments asked for his donations and senators waited for his calls. He was feared in boardrooms, worshipped by investors, and envied by the public. Every article written about him carried the same tone: untouchable, unstoppable, and unshakable. On that rainy Thursday evening, he entered the most expensive restaurant in the city as though he owned it, because in a way, he did. He had financed the hotel it was built inside. He never asked for a reservation. He demanded, and it was granted. Tonight, he was hosting 3 foreign investors who were prepared to sign a $1 billion deal. The chandeliers glittered, violins hummed faintly in the background, and waiters rushed nervously at the sight of his entourage. Richard loosened his tie, leaned back in the velvet chair, and said in a voice that carried across the room, "I'll take the usual. Rare steak. The bloodier the better." His guests laughed on cue, flattered to share the table of a man who commanded fear. The waitress assigned to his table was young, black, and silent. Her name tag read Elena. She approached with a tray of wine glasses, her eyes lowered as if avoiding his. Richard barely glanced at her. To him, she was just another face in the endless sea of staff, another servant whose existence he would forget by morning. But Elena was not forgettable. As she placed the glasses, she slipped a folded note beside his plate, quick enough that his guests didn't notice. Richard frowned. He assumed it was a mistake, maybe some silly flirtation. But when he opened the paper, his hand stiffened. His lips parted slightly, then froze. The color drained from his face. 7 words stared back at him, written in rushed, angry handwriting. "I know what you did in Miami." His wine glass trembled between his fingers. For a man who had stared down federal prosecutors, ruthless rivals, and even assassination attempts, this small piece of paper had struck harder than any bullet. His guests kept talking, unaware, but Richard could no longer hear them. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. He folded the note quickly, shoving it beneath, his hand as if hiding a weapon. His eyes flicked toward the waitress. Elena stood at the edge of the dining hall, half in the shadows, her expression unreadable. She didn't look at him directly, but he knew. She knew. Panic stirred in his stomach. The Miami incident was supposed to be gone, erased, buried under millions in hush money. Years ago, before he had consolidated his empire, a scandal had almost ended him. A young employee had died. An accident, but one that Richard had covered with bribes, threats, and a quiet settlement. Only 3 people had known the truth, and 2 of them were dead. He had convinced himself the 3rd would never come forward. But here, in the glittering glow of a restaurant filled with laughter, his past had walked straight to his table and laid itself bare. Richard forced a smile, gripping his fork so tightly his knuckles whitened. His guests toasted to profits, unaware that their host was unraveling. The room seemed hotter, smaller, suffocating. He excused himself suddenly, rising with an awkward laugh. "Gentlemen, give me just a moment," he muttered, his voice strained. In the restroom, he locked the door and stared at his reflection. Sweat ran down his temples. His empire could collapse if this note reached the wrong hands. His enemies would devour him, the deal would vanish, and he could face prison. He reread the note, searching for clues in the handwriting, in the phrasing. Miami. It had to be connected to that night. He thought of Elena's face, calm, deliberate, confident. She wasn't bluffing. She wanted him to know she held the knife at his throat. When Richard returned, his laughter was forced, his jokes hollow. He kept glancing at Elena as she moved through the room, her tray balanced with mechanical precision. At one point, their eyes met for less than a second, and it felt like a lifetime. After dinner, as his guests finally left satisfied, Richard remained behind. He couldn't. He wouldn't leave without answers. As the last of the dining crowd thinned, he gestured to Elena with a cold smile. A word. Outside. She hesitated, then nodded, leading him toward the alley behind the restaurant. Rain slicked the pavement, and the hum of traffic echoed from the distance. Richard's voice was a low growl. "Who are you? How do you know this?" Elena held his gaze for the first time. Her voice was steady, sharp, and unafraid. "I know, because she was my sister." The words hit him like a hammer. Images from Miami flashed before his eyes. The screaming, the blood, the body carried out the back door before the police arrived. He had buried it all under money and power, but now, standing in a dark alley before a waitress with fire in her eyes, he realized the past had not been buried. It had been waiting. Elena pulled another paper from her apron and held it out. "You've built towers on bones. Do you think they'll stand forever?" Richard didn't take the paper. His chest tightened. "What do you want? Money? A settlement? Name your price." Her lips curled in bitter disgust. "Money? My sister is dead because of you. I don't want your money. I want the world to know who you really are." For the first time in years, Richard felt fear crawl up his spine. He had silenced countless enemies with money, but this was different. Elena didn't want to be bought. She wanted to burn his empire to ash. His mind raced. How far would she go? Did she already leak the story? Did she have evidence? Each thought was a dagger. Elena turned to leave, her footsteps echoing. Desperation flared in him. "Wait!" he barked, his voice cracking. She stopped, but didn't turn. "You think destroying me will bring her back?" Richard hissed. "Do you even know what will happen if you speak? They'll bury you before you bury me." Elena's reply was cold as ice. "Maybe. But the truth doesn't die." That night, Richard returned to his penthouse, but he could not sleep. Every sound made him flinch. He poured himself whiskey after whiskey, his mind unraveling. The note sat on his desk, mocking him. The next morning, news alerts buzzed across his phone. Anonymous tips had reached journalists. Whispers of Miami were spreading. His PR team called in a panic, demanding answers. Investors began pulling back. The billion-dollar deal was suddenly delayed. Within 48 hours, Richard Halden's perfect world was cracking. Reporters camped outside his building, protesters gathered with signs, and his name trended worldwide with words like killer and cover-up. The empire that had taken him decades to build was collapsing in days, but the story didn't end there. 4 days after the dinner, as Richard sat in his private office surrounded by frantic lawyers, a package arrived. Inside was a small locket, old and scratched. He opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a picture of a smiling young woman, the girl from Miami, and beside it, a younger Elena. A note was tucked inside. For her, for the truth. This is not the end. Richard sank into his chair, his vision swimming. For the first time in his life, he realized he wasn't the predator anymore. He was the prey, and Elena wasn't stopping. The whispers of Miami had become roars. His allies deserted him, his board voted to strip him of power, and prosecutors circled like vultures. Yet through it all, Richard couldn't escape one thought. That waitress, with her steady eyes and her quiet fury, had destroyed him more completely than any rival ever could. And he knew, deep down, this was only the beginning.